Employees of various agencies, tell us about your most terrifying cases. Being in the FBI isn't always about chases and shootouts. Most of the work is paperwork, surveillance, and routine. But there are cases that change you forever. One of them, we called the case of the Quiet House. In 2015, we were assigned to a New England state. Children were disappearing in a small town. Not kidnapped, exactly vanished. Without a trace. 6 over 3 years. The local police were stumped. We combed through everything. And then the algorithms pointed to him. Leonard Graves. An elderly bibliographer living on the outskirts of town. The perfect neighbor. No connections to the victims. No criminal history. But all the missing children's routes led past his house, one way or another. We got a search warrant. I remember it was a quiet, sunny day. His house, it was too clean. Too silent. There was no smell of food, dust, or life. And then we found the door. Behind the bookcase in his office. It led down to the basement. As we descended, we heard no screams or cries. Instead, we were greeted by sound. A monotonous, steady hum. And a smell. The smell of ozone and old paper. There were no children in the basement. No one was there. Only 7 old tape recorders stood there. And they recorded. Each tape recorder was pointed at a crib, a high chair, at the places where the children should have been. But they were empty. Hundreds of tapes were neatly stacked on the shelves. They had dates and names on them. The names of missing children. When we detained him, he didn't resist. He just smiled and asked, "Have you ever heard silence? Real silence? The kind that remains when you can record the very sound of loneliness." He was declared insane. Not a single body was ever found. We studied every single tape. There's not a single sound on them. There's only silence. The same silence he talked about. I've encountered maniacs, violence, cruelty. But this was different. It wasn't cruelty. It was something empty, cold, absolute. And sometimes, late at night, it seems to me that he recorded not their loneliness, but ours. And that silence has lived somewhere inside me ever since. I've worked the night shift for years. You get used to everything. The drunks, the arguments, the strange addresses. It all becomes routine. But that one call, I'll never forget it. It was a thick November fog, around 3 in the morning. I got a fare to the outskirts of town. A private sector where the streets are dark as a tomb. I arrive. There's a girl at the bus stop, all alone. She's wearing a light raincoat, even though it was freezing. She gets in the back seat. Gives me the address of the old cemetery. Sure, I was nervous. But the meter was running, and she seemed normal. We drive. Total silence. She just stared out the window. I tried making conversation a couple of times. You know, cold night, long drive. She just gave me one-word answers. I checked the rearview mirror. She wasn't moving. At all. Like a statue. And her coat was bone dry. Even though it was wet and foggy outside. There should have been some moisture. We get to the cemetery. She says, "Stop here at this gate." So I stop. She pays me, with a normal bill. I even give her the change. She says, "Thank you," and gets out. I watch her walk towards the gate in my mirror. Then I turn the car around and drive off. Later, when I was counting my earnings, I found a crumpled piece of paper mixed in with the cash. I smoothed it out. And written on it, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for not looking back." Goosebumps. Head to toe. I immediately called the dispatcher to check the log. They told me, "Your vehicle didn't have any logged fares in that area last night. According to GPS, you were in a completely different part of the city." To this day, I don't know who, or what, I drove that night. And the most chilling part, what did she not want me to see? I've been a crane operator for 15 years. I've lifted everything from concrete slabs to fragile glass. But one story still keeps me up at night. It happened at an old construction site, where they were clearing space for a new business center. Nearby was an old abandoned cemetery that was about to be relocated. I was tasked with dismantling a tall brick chimney, dating back to Soviet times. It was a familiar task. I secured the grapple ball and climbed up to my cabin. It was at the height of a 7-story building. The weather was strange, no wind, but the crane boom swayed slightly. I chalked it up to fatigue. I started working. The ball struck the chimney for the first time, and suddenly, in my headphones, we have a radio there, I heard children's laughter.
Clear, ringing. I radio, où est messing around?
The fitters below just threw up their hands, as if to say, they hadn't heard anything. I made another pass with the ball. And then my crane jerked. Abruptly. As if someone had given the boom a hard push from below. I could barely stay in my seat. I looked down, and there, on the boom, right along the metal truss, was a girl. About 5 years old. In a white dress. And she wasn't looking around. She was walking straight toward me, into the cabin.
My skin crawled.
The height was so enormous. I grabbed the radio and shouted, "What, did you lift a child onto a crane?" And they replied, "Are you crazy? There's no one here." And she kept coming. Almost to the cabin. and I saw that her dress was wet, and water was dripping from the hem, right onto the boom. She walked right up to the cabin, pressed her palms against the glass, and looked up at me, and her eyes, empty, dark, like wells, and she whispered so loudly that I could hear through the glass.
Don't destroy your house.
I was shocked, and she turned and walked back.
And halfway up the boom, she simply vanished into thin air.
Everyone down below saw that I had turned pale. They lowered me to the ground. I told them everything. The old foreman later took me aside and said, "This chimney was built in the 50s. They say a girl from a neighboring village fell into the concrete while pouring the foundation. She was left there, and the cemetery is her family." The next day, the chimney was finally torn down, but I never took a shift on such projects again. And to this day, sometimes I seem to see wet footprints on the asphalt, and I hear that quiet whisper, "Don't destroy our house." I work for the Belarusian Ministry of Emergency Situations. One of the most terrifying calls we received was at 4:39 a.m., when we were told a residential building was on fire. When we arrived, we saw a huge 10-story building. It was completely ablaze, with people jumping out of the windows in hopes of saving themselves. There were also people standing on the roof, and we tried to rescue them. I was standing below, providing first aid to the victims. There were people with children on the roof. About 10 of my colleagues were there. The building collapsed, and not even half the people were saved. I'm a volunteer. We respond to calls with the police and assist them as best we can. One day in early November, we responded to a missing person call about a 10-year-old child. The parents were heavy drinkers, and we often visited them because of the constant drinking and conflicts between drinking buddies. Their home was a veritable den of intoxication. I'm still amazed they weren't stripped of their parental rights. But they still called the police themselves. Apparently, parental instinct overcame their addiction, or so I thought. As usual, we questioned them, but there wasn't much information available. They said their son had gone out for a walk and never returned. A long search followed, but we returned to that house several more times after that, responding to calls related to drunken brawls. 4 months after their child's disappearance, the parents were arrested. Patrol officers stopped them one night while they were transporting something in a cart. It turned out to be their son's body. The most terrifying thing is that during interrogation, they admitted to keeping their son's body in their cellar the entire time. So every time we responded to their report, we were just a few meters away from the body of the child they were looking for. My grandfather, a firefighter, told me this story about how he couldn't save the life of a man who was pinned under beams. He tried to lift the beams, but unfortunately, he wasn't strong enough, so he foolishly took off the top of his fire protection clothing and tried to lift the burning beams with his bare hands. The man died, and my grandfather was no longer able to use his arms properly or without pain.